Hello, my students. Today we are going to learn about comparatives and superlatives. Let's get right into it. Comparative adjectives and adverbs, what are they? Imagine you want to compare two things, maybe two cars, two friends, or two ways of doing something. How would you do that in English? Don't worry, it's actually pretty simple. We'd have to use something called comparatives. We'll start with comparative adjectives first. Adjectives are used for describing nouns such as people, places, or things. When comparing two nouns, we use adjectives. How are comparative adjectives formed? It depends on the number of syllables an adjective has. For one-syllable adjectives, we add er to the adjective. Fast becomes faster. For example, John can run faster than Karen. Remember, the key is to use than after the comparative form. It shows you're making a comparison between two things or actions, which in this case, you're comparing John and Karen. If the adjective ends in a vowel consonant pattern, we double the final consonant before adding er. Thin becomes thinner. You can say, this notebook is thinner than this one. For adjectives with two syllables that end in y, we first need to change y to I, and then proceed to add er. Funny becomes funnier. For example, I think comedy series are funnier than drama series. For adjectives that are two syllables or more, we use the word more or less before the adjective. Intelligent becomes more intelligent or less intelligent. You could say, my brother is more intelligent than I. Now let's take a look at comparative adverbs. Adverbs describe verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. They tell us how something is done. When we compare how two actions are performed, we use comparative adverbs. For most regular adverbs, those that end in ly, we need to add more or less before them, which is somewhat similar to two-syllable adjectives. For example, carefully becomes more or less carefully, or easily becomes more or less easily. Let's take a look at several examples of regular comparative adverbs. He drives more carefully than his brother. She sings less beautifully than he. Now that you have gotten to know how to compare two nouns or two actions, what about comparing three or more objects? That's when the superlatives come in. The way to form superlative adjectives and adverbs are similar to comparative ones to a certain extent. It also depends on how many syllables the adjective or the adverb has. First, let's take a look at the adjectives. For one-syllable adjectives, we add the and est to the adjective. Safe becomes the safest. For example, my house is the safest place on earth. If the adjective ends in a vowel consonant pattern, we double the final consonant before adding est. Hot becomes the hottest. That was the hottest day of the summer. For adjectives with two syllables that end in y, we first need to change y to I and then proceed to add est. Pretty becomes the prettiest. You could say, Clarkson is the prettiest girl in her class. For adjectives that are two syllables or more, we use the word the most or the least before the adjective. Beautiful becomes the most beautiful or the least beautiful. For example, this is the most or the least beautiful painting in the entire museum. For most regular adverbs, those that end in ly, we need to add the most or the least before the adverb. For example, carefully becomes the most or the least carefully. Let's take a look at more examples regarding superlative regular adverbs. She sings the most beautifully in the choir. My grandmother drives the most carefully of anyone I know. Since you now know what comparatives and superlatives are, let's do a little bit of comparison to help reinforce your knowledge. In this sentence, my brother is taller than I. There were only two people being compared, so the comparative taller was used. If we want to compare more people, we would use the tallest. For example, my brother is the tallest person in the family. Some comparatives and superlatives in English don't follow the usual rules. These are formed by simply adding er, est, more, almost, like we've just learned. Let's take the adjective bad for example. The comparative for bad isn't better, neither is the superlative baddest. The comparative for bad is worse, and the superlative is the worst. My bicycle was worse than I expected. It was the worst vehicle I've ever bought. This is also the case for the adverb badly, which is worse and the worst. For example, though he performed worse than usual, surprisingly, his competitor was the worst. Let's move on to the adjective good and the adverb well, which are the opposite of bad and badly. The comparative for good and well is better, and the superlative is the best. You could say, my sister is better at math than I am, but I am the best at English. Next up, let's look at the adjective far, which describes distance. The comparative form is farther or further, and the superlative form is the farthest or the furthest. For example, my house is farther from school than Jenny's house, and Alice lives the farthest away in our class. A quantifier is a word that goes before a noun to express how much or how many of something there is. For the quantifier little, the comparative is less and the superlative is the least. For instance, I have little experience. Tom has less experience than I do. Mary has the least among all the members of this company. Much and many are both quantifiers. We use many for countable nouns and much for uncountable nouns. The two of them become more in comparative form and the most in superlative form. For example, my sister has more shoes than I do. In fact, she has the most pairs of shoes in my family. And that's it for today's grammar journey. Remember to practice these forms more often if you wish to be better and more confident in using English. Thank you for watching.